So you've made a major, huge, excellent new commission for Manchester International Festival, Captioning the City, which sits over 22 sites in Manchester, including fancy shopping centres, hotels, Manchester Deaf Centre, and the Sky. Tell me more.
You know, actually, I've been in touch with MIF, as I call them, for many years, and we've been trying to figure out when we could work together and how to work together, and it just hasn't panned out. But it did this time. And because it did, I thought, well, why don't I just go big? And I threw out this huge idea of captioning the city, and they said yes. And I was actually shocked. I thought they would be like, we can't pull this off, Christine, but they can, and they did, and we did, and we're working on it. And we're actually still working on it. People think that we're done, but it's still in progress in a way. Like, what I think is great is because the pandemic also isn't done, that this kind of encourages people to go outside and to see the city. And as far as the captioning aspect of it, a lot of it has to do with my thoughts on open captions and closed captions. I'm not as familiar with the experience in the UK, but in the US, when you turn on a TV, captions are automatically closed captioned, and you have to enable them. And oftentimes to enable them, you have to go through a few menu settings to kind of navigate your way to the enable button of closed captions. But what I want is captions to be there as soon as I turn on the TV, and I want to choose if I want to turn it off or not. I don't necessarily have that option with closed caption. It's the opposite way. And then when it comes to open captions, they're burned in, and so you can't actually turn them off, but they are there right away. And so I leaned a little bit more into that. And what I decided to do is look at the city as the screen and stretch it out. And I also enjoy the idea of daily interventions into daily life. And I thought that captioning the city would be great that way. I mean, you're familiar with my work, so you know that I tend to find captions in any way I can. And especially sound captions is a topic or a medium that I like to work with oftentimes. And so since I am an artist who works with sound captions to me works, because I've always felt like sound is actually something that is beyond just the auditorial experience. I believe that sound can be emotions, objects, time, history. And that comes up a lot in my work. And so what's nice is that these daily interventions kind of force captions in people's daily lives. It also puts it in their face and continues to do it for 18 days. Actually, somebody described my work as like a monument. And I'm like, yeah, some of my work is monumental maybe, but only for 18 days. But I would love to have a monument where my work stands as it is now for as long as it can.
Brilliant. Gorgeous. I mean, I love this idea of like almost trolling, you know, through these closed captions, these open captions, sorry. It's like you can't turn these off.
Trolling, right? Yeah, it's almost like people are like, where's the closed caption button on the remote? Just trying to turn it off and find it and turn it off. No luck there though.
I guess usually you would have been in Manchester planning this work and, you know, there for the opening. So how's it been trying to get the measure of a place and to locate that essence, I guess, that you're presenting through the captions when you're not there?
You know, admittedly, I'm still struggling with guilt a little bit for having not made it to Manchester. And you're right, like, how do I capture the essence of the city? But I just couldn't go. The pandemic was going. I have a daughter to think of. And so one way that we worked around that is just the fact that the MIF team is so amazing. my point of contacts were mostly Hannah and Mai, and they're great, but so is everyone on the team. Hannah kind of did the work of researching different places about the city and putting that into a doc. And I took a look at that document and couldn't really figure out how to make choices if I'd never been there, and how to make choices remotely as well. Part of my thought process is that I wanted to be sensitive to the history of Manchester and familiarize myself with it before I just threw out caption ideas. And I wanted to know kind of what are the big hubs or what people like to do in Manchester. And so what I did is kind of look at the city as people. Like, I looked at the buildings as people and thought about what these buildings would tell us and what the buildings wanted us to know about them, and kind of navigated the caption process that way.
I mean, I remember you told me a while ago how great the MIF team were.
And it's still true, continues to be so. Yeah, they really are.
That's brilliant.
The fact that they pulled off this whole thing working remotely with me, I mean, this is the largest works I've ever done to this day. I mean, it's all over the entire city, and I never made it to the city. So that's how grateful I am for the fact that we did something at this scale.
Well, we'll visit together soon, yeah?
I'm ready. That will be our plan.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned your commission for Art Night. When you made that work, we worked with Frank Barden's School for Deaf Children and the amazing kids there. And I wondered if you've been able to engage with any of the deaf communities in Manchester.
That's a good question. You know, whenever I can on any project I do, I try to connect to the local deaf community or get a local deaf element to it. But for this one, I admit that it wasn't front of mind for me as we started the project, until somebody on the team brought up the fact that there is a Manchester Deaf Center. And I didn't realize that. So the first thing I did was text a bunch of my friends who are deaf who live in the UK and ask around about the Deaf Center there. Because the Manchester Deaf Center actually isn't like in the heart of the city. It's kind of outside of the city center. And so I wanted to think about proximity and geography and distance as well, because I didn't want to force people to go outside of the city if it didn't necessarily make sense for the rest of the scale of the project. But everyone said, no, this is like, the center is on a busy street, people will pass by. And so what I did is ask a few more questions to the deaf community. And what I found out is that the Manchester Deaf Center is a great place for deaf elders, where there aren't so many spaces like that still in England and in the UK. And so my understanding is that the Deaf Center is under the University of Manchester, or like that the University of Manchester has rights to the building. And so what I decided for that building is to make the caption of the sound of BSL asking, or no, let me start over. It's the sound of BSL asking why there isn't one universal spoken language. Because people always actually ask me that question about sign language. But what's really funny is that even between the UK and the US, there's actually different sign languages. There's British Sign Language and American Sign Language. And so people don't always realize that. And so I wanted to make the center be able to be a point there.
It's really nice. And then another thing you mentioned earlier was something that we also experienced. So you and I had been talking for quite a long time about doing something together before your Art Night commission, but it was never quite the right context. And you said it was the same here in Manchester. And I think you are particularly good at having the self-determination to know which projects are right, and also making sure that they fit within your practice at that moment in time.
I mean, sometimes I admit, like, I still am learning how to say no. That's not something I do effortlessly at this point, but sometimes when it's more of a question of effort, it's like, okay, well then can we make this happen? And if we can, then great. When it came to art night in London, that was something that it seemed like we could make happen. And that is a question I ask because I don't have an assistant. I do everything myself. And so it does matter who the team is and who we're working with, because then that makes it feel like some things are possible when I wouldn't think they are normally.
Mm. And then continuing the theme of self-determination, so much of your work is about taking up space and refusing to be excluded. Was that always the case for you?
That wasn't something I always had, especially growing up. Growing up, I actually had very limited space. And that was the space that I kind of accepted for myself. And then I had so many different moments of awakening and maybe moments of enhancing and creating space and leaning into that space and claiming that space. And so that's what's gotten me here. And once I kind of got here, I realized, like, yeah, this is my space. I am here and this is mine. And I realized that the best way to get what I want is just kind of to be present in someone's face, right? And sometimes I hustled really well in doing that, and sometimes I didn't.
Mm. Yeah. And I guess kind of in the same vein, you talk a lot about rage. And I feel that this rage or anger, I don't know which you prefer, I guess they're quite different, is really central to your work. And I think it's important to note that the importance of rage or anger, because the work looks so great. It's often funny, it's often witty, and these things are really important, but that inherent anger is crucial, I think, to your work.
I agree. It is crucial. And I would like to say something on that note. Like sometimes, well, let me start over. You asked about like anger versus rage a little bit kind of in your question. I do see them differently. To me, anger is like a reaction to a situation, maybe like a one-off situation, big or small, whereas rage to me is more about an accumulation of reactions. So it's not that you're ever responding to these one-off, one-time situations, and it's an accumulation of slights, if you will, or experiences that have stoked this rage to continue on. And there's been a lot of oppression in the deaf community, and so not everyone handles it well. And I think that rage is a great way to communicate the experiences that I've had as a deaf person, and the fact that deaf rage is very specific to this institutionalized oppression. And so to me, rage is actually another way of claiming space. If I didn't have rage, I don't think I would find myself actually in Manchester doing this, quite frankly.
Yep.
I just want to find ways to have my community, the deaf community, on everyone's mind. And this is a perfect instance in which I can do that.
Christine, you've already done so much. And I think that moment, I guess it was before the pandemic, was it, when you signed the national anthem at the Super Bowl? That was, I mean, to me, that felt huge. Did it feel huge to you?
I mean, it's funny because Beth, the interpreter who's here with us today, was actually the interpreter at the Super Bowl with me too. And and as I mean, to me so far, the Super Bowl has been my favorite experience so far. And it really was, I mean, let me put it this way. I'm shocked at the kind of impact it has made. It still impacts now. I always thought like at the Super Bowl, I'd kind of be there on a separate platform as just as a deaf person, but the art world actually really responded to that experience as well. And so did other communities, and everyone actually responded quite favorably. And realistically, I am the first deaf Asian person to be on a platform like this. There have been other deaf people, but not deaf Asian people. And I think that the op-ed that I wrote up in the New York Times the next day was a great way of continuing the conversation and the impact. It wasn't that I was just on this kind of national platform or stage once. It was something that continued on. But yeah, I look back at it as an amazing experience. I just can't believe it.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to finish up because I think we're almost at time, but let me finish by coming back to the idea of finding or coming to the essence of something. So your work is often occupied with describing sound or finding language that rewires our brains a bit. So I guess to consider what it means to experience something. And I love one of your captions in Manchester, the sound of searching for hand sanitizer. And I feel like many years in the future, reading that sentence will have the capacity to bring me right back to how it feels to be here right now. I guess the same way that a scent can do.
You know, it's so funny because hand sanitizer does like have its own story. Like I used to think it was kind of gross. I didn't like the smell. I didn't like when people used it. But now it's become this mandatory aspect of life that is really important, especially considering that I have a child who isn't vaccinated because of her age. And so I have to wait. And so hand sanitizer now has become so specific to 2020 and 2021 and maybe years beyond it. But it does feel very like of the 2020 era, an object and a smell that recalls it. Like the last time I used hand sanitizer was last night, right? I'm still in that era.
Same. Yeah, exactly the same. Yeah.